All right. Hey, yeah, thanks for joining me and Regan. This is Let's Talk, and we're happy to be here. We've got a good show planned. Before I get into it too much, though, let me start by taking Reggie's message one step farther. Don't just call the number to support the station. Call the number and become a BAI buddy in the name of Let's Talk with John and Regan.
Exactly.
And look, it is we are honored to be on the radio in New York City on WBAI. Look, and we're glad to be here, but it's not enough for us to be glad to be here. You got to be glad to hear a perspective that you're not hearing elsewhere. So if you do like hearing a perspective, whether you agree with us or not, or whether Regan and I agree with each other or not, if you want to hear this kind of discourse, if you want to hear the perspective that we bring to the table on issues that are not only directly affect us but directly affect you, then support the program, support the station, and again, go to the pledge line 516-620-3602. Become a BAI buddy in the name of Let's Talk. Look, you can go online as well. You can go to www.give2wbai.org. That's GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org, and show your support for the station and show your support for what we're trying to deliver here as well. All right, let me go ahead and introduce Regan once again. Regan, it's great to have you with us.
It's always great to be back. It's my favorite time of the week.
Well, you and I, we usually throw a couple of ideas back and forth, in the days before the show starts, and you know, when we talk about the timeliness of issues, we can actually talk about the same thing each week because the same issues are pressing us. But we sometimes got to jump outside of our perhaps not just our comfort zone, but our geographic zone. And as two native voices on New York City radio, I think it's important that we offer a perspective on what's happening elsewhere around the world. And you suggested that we talk about the growing crises that are happening in both Bolivia and Chile. And it's obviously there's problems elsewhere, but I think we can concentrate on those two places. And this was your suggestion, so I'm going to let you kind of take lead on this story. I've been following it myself as well. So I don't know. Give me your thoughts on both places and where we should be focusing some attention.
Absolutely. As you said, like it's important for us to go outside of our general comfort zones. And it's also important for us to remind folks that there are indigenous people outside of, the so-called United States and so-called Canada, especially if we're talking about Central and South America. So I wanted to focus today specifically on a lot of the indigenous uprisings that are happening in South America. And we're going to be focusing specifically on Chile and Bolivia. But I wanted to start with Chile because it's been an incredibly changing and it's been a changing crisis that has been going on since about the 1990s, to be honest. And recently, there's been a continued resurgence in these kinds of efforts by the indigenous people of Chile, specifically the Mapuche people, who have a legacy of anti-government resistance. They really go hard against a number of different corporations over land issues, over water issues. And recently there has been a bit of change in the tide, if you will, due to COVID. As you can imagine, and as John and I have spoken many times before here on the radio, COVID is disproportionately affecting Black and Indigenous communities. And as we are speaking in terms of Indigenous communities right now, the Mapuche people of Chile are really taking a hit in terms of COVID outbreak and lack of access to both healthcare, PPE, and a lot of that is related to anti-Indigenous racist sentiment by the Chilean government. So most recently, a Mapuche spiritual leader named Celestino Cordova was on a 107-day hunger strike. And last week, he released his final statement. Honestly, it was the last thing that would be heard by his people. And a good friend of mine and a member of the Indigenous Kinship Collective, Lydia, has been doing some excellent. She is Mapuche and she lives in Chile. She used to be here in Lenape, Hoking, and she went to Chile to work with her people. She transcribed his last words, and we put it on our Instagram page on the Indigenous Kinship Collective. And the amount of response that we got back by people moved by his words was really, really incredible. In which he states, that this is a fight for all Indigenous people, a fight for land, and a fight for access to resources, access to healthcare. General human rights is something that cannot be ignored, just because we're Indigenous. We deserve access to all the things. And more importantly, he really focuses his last statement on access to land, which is something that folks may not know, is that Indigenous communities in different parts of the world, specifically in South America, don't have like reservations as we do, or don't have land allotments as we do, and are constantly fighting for reclamation of land, and even just for the government to actually to even just acknowledge that Indigenous people exist and Indigenous people have rights to their land. So it's been this ongoing process. And actually, one of the things that he was requesting in his last statement was that he would be able to have access to his lands before he died. And mind you, this is a young man; he's in his late 20s, but is in debilitating health because of being imprisoned for so long without access to health care. And so it's been a number of different things. It's COVID, as well as ongoing Mapuche unrest. And it's come to this moment where just on August 18th, a decision was made between Celestino Cordova and the Chilean government in terms of what it would look like for him to serve the last part of his sentence under house arrest in his community, as well as how many other Mapuche prisoners have been on hunger strike in different jails in solidarity with Celestino Cordova and Mapuche people. So that's kind of what's happening right now.
Well, and even beyond just what's happening in those specific regions, you've seen a real pushback that started back in October when the price of mass transit went up,
Mm-hmm.
and what people have to understand is, for one thing, when we talk about Indigenous people, you can see the lines where poverty and indigeneity run hand in hand. I mean, the difference between the wealthy and the poor are right along racial lines, and there's as it is in most places, but it's clear that's where the lines are drawn in places like Bolivia and Chile. So, and when you raise the price on something like bus fare or train fare or subways, or even like sales tax, or any kind of user fees, those things are always disproportionately they always disproportionately affect poor people. It ends up being a larger piece of whatever their income is. If you're wealthy and you pay a percentage more on sales tax, or if the price of even basic goods goes up, it's still it's not like it's only going up proportional to your income. So if you're living at the poverty line or below the poverty line, or even if you're middle class, any of this stuff, any of these price increases dramatically affect you. So back in October, there was this. There were major uprising, and then they went beyond Santiago and they went throughout the rest of the country, where the fight over wages, over healthcare, education, and again, economic disparity were really what the protests were all about. And of course, once COVID affected, and as you said, it disproportionately affects the poorer people and Indigenous people. So, the healthcare component of those protests, becomes even more exacerbated. So, there has the other thing that I think made this thing tick up was President Pinera was suggesting that they would hold some sort of referendum in April to do constitutional reforms, and because of COVID-19, they were pushing those off until the fall, and that just made people react even more strongly. So, there's a general uprising that's happening that right along class lines, right along indigenous lines, if you will, and I think it's been exacerbated by a number of issues.
Yeah, and the demands revolve mainly around three themes, which is jurisdictional autonomy, return to ancestral lands, and the respect of cultural identity. So it's as I stated, this has been going on for quite some time. There's always been indigenous resistance, but specifically in the 1990s, this is when like Mapuche folks really started organizing in a way that had really not been seen previously, or even understood previously by the Chilean government, which was that there was this building of a hydroelectric plant, and it was incredibly controversial around the Mapuche and pro Mapuche groups, because the area that would be flooded was sacred land, including an ancient Mapuche cemetery. And when I say ancient, I mean ancient Mapuche cemetery. And the plant was still built without Mapuche consideration, without hearing their calls for this not to be built. There was a number of incidents then again happening in 2009, which were that a number of Mapuche organizers came together to occupy farmlands. And these are farmlands that are mostly owned by European immigrants or settlers, and coming in and buying up large tracts of land in Chile where land is cheap, and then removing indigenous people off the land to, for cattle grazing, for farming. And a number of Mapuche people reclaimed those areas and held sit-ins. And unfortunately, a number of Mapuche folks were unjustly murdered by the police in those altercations. And since 2010 and 11, there's been a series of hunger strikes in terms of Mapuche people who were arrested for doing that land defender work, who were imprisoned in Chile. And the conditions within these prisons were, deplorable and unacceptable. And now, fast forward to COVID, these prisons are still horrible, disgusting places of torture, place of uncleanliness, truly just horrible pits. And folks still don't have access to PPE and so that was some of the work that Lydia from Indigenous Kinship Collective was really doing, and some of the work that we did with the collective was raising money to hire Indigenous women to sew masks for the Mapuche community. And we sent, thousands of dollars down to Chile for folks to be able to buy, just access to for example, the women's prison in Temuco, which is considered the capital of Mapuche territory, does not offer sanitary napkins or tampons or any sort of menstrual items in the women's prison. They're expected to pay for that. So, even just getting those items down to folks, getting masks down to folks, really just providing for the community has been something that IKC has been really invested in. And we just started doing that. Mapuche people have been organizing, as I said, for decades now, in terms of requesting or demanding better treatment, not just in prisons, but outside of prison. So it's been a number of events that have kind of have really bubbled over into this really tumultuous point. And one of which is the reason that Celestino Cordova is, his name is Machi Celestino. Machi is the term of a healer in the community. Machi Celestino Cordova. He is being accused of a murder, of an arson murder of 2 farmers. And 11 other Mapuche people were arrested for the same crime, and there was such a lack of evidence that all of them were acquitted of the charges except for him. And of course, the conversation now becomes, he's being held unjustly. There is a lack of evidence in terms of this double murder, but he is not the only Machi or spiritual leader that is being imprisoned right now in Chile. So we see that the Chilean government is really removing spiritual leaders from Mapuche communities in an attempt to destabilize.
Yeah, I
Which,
mean, and anytime you talk about people who have a major influence within a community, and when we talk about spiritual leaders or healers or anybody who offers, that kind of guidance, they end up being a focal point, and they get concentrated on. I also wanted to mention, it's important that people always remember that when you're talking about a marginalized people, that becomes increasingly exacerbated when you talk about women within those marginalized people. Because that's
absolutely.
and you're talking about the basic needs in a prison, for instance. But in general, women are always going to bear a higher level of you know of oppression than even the men within those groups. And I think it's important that people realize that. The other thing I wanted to mention is when we talk about land rights, what we're talking about is land use. The fact that and we see this with all indigenous populations, even to the extent that there's an acknowledgement about our occupation of a region. We oftentimes see significant restrictions put down on what we can do on those lands. Even when governments will acknowledge that that's where we live, or that those are our regions, if you will. Even in the absence of defined territories, as you were mentioning, there's always the question of what rights we can defend and enjoy on those lands.
Yeah, and I don't think it's something that I really want folks to understand, that and not just folks who are listening, but also indigenous people that are not from, that are, let's say, North American indigenous people versus South and Central and South American indigenous people, is that there is a huge discrepancy between, we're treated like shit here. And then down south, it's a whole nother level of lack of rights, lack of governments even acknowledging the existence of indigenous communities. It's an incredibly different world, that I want to urge listeners to do some research in terms of in terms of like the differences and the discrepancies. And of course, this isn't an oppression Olympics, but rather it's just important to understand that there are differences in the way that indigenous people are treated here, which is poorly, and how indigenous people are treated in Central and South America, which is also poorly. There is the one thing that we can say is that all throughout Turtle Island and Condor Island, we are 100% oppressed. So it's an interesting. I hate to use the word case study because that feels so anthropological, but it's an interesting case study to really consider the differences between how the colonizing governments treat indigenous people. And one of the reasons why this is really being resurfaced in terms of news coverage is that because of this hunger strike that Machi Celestino Cordova was participating in, along with 20 other Mapuche leaders who are also imprisoned, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights is actually now in Chile, and is visiting the hospital of the regional hospital of Temuco, where Celestino Cordova is being treated, and is conducting a set of what has been quoted as fierce interviews, which I don't know what that means, in order to really investigate and probe how Mapuche people are being treated in terms of prison, in terms of land rights, in terms of even public protest. The amount of police violence that Mapuche people are experiencing for peaceful protests is incredibly destructive. So we can see even that there are mirroring symptoms of colonialism on both sides of this conversation, which is where we are versus where Mapuche people are. Nonetheless, the UN is paying attention, which of course that puts more pressure on the Chilean government to do something, which is why we all assume that now Celestino Cordova will be able to go into house arrest moving forward and be on his land. So I think that's an interesting thing because, I don't really love the UN. I don't think the UN does much, but to have the UN there has put some pressure on the
Well,
Chilean
it
government.
is a platform, and I think, as much as many of us, especially Native people, have been frustrated at the inactivity of the UN. I think we still have to keep pressuring. I mean, and I say the same thing about other governments that I don't support. In the U.S. I mean, we look at what's happening with the election cycle. It's still important that we hold people accountable. Hey, I want to address something that you mentioned. I think it is important that people realize that even on this side, in Turtle Island versus the southern continent, that there is diversity, and that it's hard. You can't just define indigenous people as one monolithic group. That
Absolutely.
when you talk about the adversity that they face being so much worse than the adversity that we face, even amongst native people in the on the U.S. or within what is known as Canada, the adversity can range
Of course.
tremendously. I mean, and it could be abject poverty in some places. We've talked about Pine Ridge before, and other places. Um, but yeah, the conditions that we find ourselves in, from region to region, from culture to culture, and native culture to native culture, can be dramatically different. And so when you suggest that people do research, I think the first thing that people have to do, even as they're doing that research, is understand that you cannot just lump indigenous people into one group.
Absolutely.
On one hand, you know, when you look at into some of these places in South America, the indigenous population may be a much larger percentage of the population in many of these countries, but that doesn't mean that population or that those numbers have given them power. If anything, it's made them in many ways even more subject, and more dramatically subject to oppression. And I think that's important that people understand that.
Absolutely. As I said previously, like this isn't an oppression Olympics. We
That's
are all being
that term.
oppressed.
I've heard that term like 4 times in the last week. Oppression Olympics.
Yeah,
I didn't
it's
realize that people
important.
are just trying to compete about who's got it worse. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely something that happens, and it's definitely something that I see compare. I see it in Indian country. This like my nation's more oppressed than your nation, and in the end, any people under a colonial government are oppressed. So we are part. We are. I believe that we are in solidarity with all indigenous people, but I also understand that there are such differences within indigenous populations within the way that we are treated from nation state to nation state, from settler state to settler state, that it's truly for me it was an awakening when I went to Guatemala for the first time as a child. And I'm indigenous on both sides. My father is indigenous and so is my mother. And when I went to Guatemala for the first time, seeing the difference in how indigenous people are treated there, it was also for me, you know shocking. And I already knew we were treated like crap on this side of the border. So I really do urge people to do. There's a huge amount of erasure that happens with indigenous populations throughout Turtle Island and throughout Condor Island. So I think that if people could start to, Chile is a great place to start because there's so much resistance happening right now. And just to see how corporations like Nestle come in and try to privatize water, how hydroelectric plants, or in Bolivia, there's a huge mining, for silver. There's huge mining companies coming in and really trying to destroy the land. I would just urge people to do a little research because it's something that I've been challenging myself to do. And it's been an incredible journey to see how there are so many differences within our oppression and also so many similarities as well.
Well, and it's also when people think of hydroelectric, they may immediately think, well, that's good, that's sustainable. But the amount of flooding and the way flooding is done to create the dams, to create these headwaters for hydroelectric, can have significant environmental impact. Not only because it messes with migratory patterns, it floods out arable lands and that kind of stuff. But when you flood certain regions, there are certain minerals, and not all of them are the healthiest things, for all of us, that are trapped that percolate up and that become. You can have high levels of mercury and other and other elements that you know that I guess present themselves and when you flood out regions that have been either arid or certainly not submerged. So there's a lot that goes. We saw a lot of this on the Canadian side because Hydro Quebec flooded out these
Hmm.
huge areas in Quebec, and the amount of pollution. And although these are naturally occurring elements, by virtue of flooding out these huge areas and the decay that happens within, because they don't clear out all the vegetation the same way, the amount of decay. Look, these plants are sequestering a lot of elements that we benefit from that sequestration. And when we submerge those, you're releasing all of that stuff. And I don't think people quite fully grasp, the downside of hydroelectric.
I don't. Yeah. I mean, in the same way that people don't really talk about how solar panels require plastics, which are made from oil extraction. So there, of course, like, would I prefer things in solar panels? Would I prefer hydroelectric? Would I prefer wind power? Yes, 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 all along. But also, they're they're not 100% clean in the way that they're marketed to us. And I think
Well,
that,
especially utility scale.
oh, of course,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Oh God, I've
yeah.
been learning so much about that recently, and it's been truly just uh, annoying, I think, is the best way to say that.
Yeah. Hey, we made it to the bottom of the hour, so why don't we'll take a little bit of a break. We'll have Reggie take us out with a little bit of music, and we'll come back and we'll talk about Bolivia, because obviously Bolivia is in crisis as well, and we'll do that when we come back. This is John Kane with Regan and and this is Let's Talk. Look, before we get back into it, I want to remind people that this show not only airs on WBAI, but we put it out as a podcast. We do stream the show live on Facebook, but we also take that video and we put it up on our YouTube channel. And if you're not subscribed to our podcast, if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV, and by the way, if you subscribe to our podcast, you got to do that as Let's Talk Native Podcast. If you're not subscribed to our podcast or to our YouTube channel, you're missing some content, and you're actually missing, especially from a YouTube standpoint, a better way to view the show. There are all kinds of problems that we can encounter with Facebook live streaming. I like doing it, but sometimes the connectivity can be slow. So I do encourage people to subscribe to the Let's Talk Native podcast and to our Let's Talk Native TV YouTube channel, and that way you can, and there's actually special content we do. We do short form videos on the YouTube channel and that kind of stuff. So I encourage people to check it out. You can also go to our website, which is www.letstalknative.com for more information. I also want to remind people, again, WBAI is always in need of listener support, as is this program on WBAI. So I encourage people to go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602, to make a pledge of any size. Become a BAI buddy in the name of Let's Talk. Or you can go to the website and follow the links to do it there as well. And that's www.give2wbai.org. All right. Look, and I'm not suggesting that we've had enough said on Chile. There's a lot that folks should pay attention to. Specifically, look, again, there's a lot that's going on in South America in general. Venezuela, Brazil, and much of the conflict exists along indigenous lines, and social class, which is also correlates with indigeneity in a lot of cases. So there's a lot to follow there, and and there's look, the governments aren't always the most stable. The United States always puts their hand in some of that instability, as we've seen from time to time, and of course, almost all of the political conflicts divide right along racial lines, and having said that, it's probably time to talk about Bolivia. In Bolivia, we saw many of us native people, indigenous people, saw for the first time an indigenous person rise to the level of prominence and leadership in a country, and we saw Evo Morales become the president of Bolivia. And there were people who worked against him right from the get-go, including pressure in the United States that to undermine Evo Morales. They ultimately did force him out of office, trying to raise a lot of issues about election fraud and that kind of thing, with the promise. And of course, they put some blonde-haired, fair-eyed woman in his spot. And they promised they were going to hold presidential elections that would produce a legitimate president, and of course that hasn't happened. And so there have been a tremendous amount of resistance that's come from the indigenous population. At some point, I think there was nearly 150 roadblocks by pro Morales protesters who were demanding that that they hold these elections, as soon as possible. I don't know. I'll turn it over to you, Regan, because I know that you had some specific things that you wanted to mention, but I just want to throw some of that out there as well. Oh, do we still have Regan? Oh, let me see. Do I still have
Up.
Regan? Oh,
Can you
there
hear
you are.
me?
There you are. Did it,
Oh,
you might have muted yourself.
I did. I keep every time we do a break, I mute myself so that you don't for whatever reason, and then when we come back, I always forget. So,
Yeah,
what I was
we don't want to catch all that head scratching.
yeah, exactly. So, similar to what is happening in Chile and honestly in a number of places, the pressures that COVID has really, COVID has exacerbated already faults in systems already. Like we've
Well,
always had racism.
it highlights the disparity. I mean,
Yes,
like I
like
said, it's there already, but when you throw something like this into the mix, it worsens. For the people who are struggling, it always worsens their condition.
absolutely. So I in the same way that we see that there are uprisings in many different places throughout the world, the I hate using conflict. That doesn't seem like the appropriate term, but let's just I'll use it for now. The conflict in Bolivia is similar, in which COVID has exacerbated already. Uh, Already great movements for social change. So specifically in Tarija, Bolivia, there's been a number of anti-government protesters that have participated in this large blockade of many of the country's main roads, which has created a bit of a challenge, for, if you will, for the Bolivian government. And it is specifically in response to the delay of the general elections, as well as the government's poor response to the coronavirus pandemic. These protesters, many of which are indigenous, are in support of the former president Evo Morales, who was ousted via a coup back in October, a coup supported by the United States,
Of
which is
course.
important to note. And for folks who are unaware, and really, this is something that I urge folks to look into, is that in Central and South America, the CIA, as well as other U.S. military organizations, have participated in a number of violent coups that have led to oppressive regimes. I mean, we saw this also actually in Afghanistan um, with the Taliban and the USSR during the Cold War. So this is not new, but I think it's important for folks to understand that there have been U.S.-backed coups throughout, specifically Central and South America, and it's often when indigenous or socialist organizers, politicians really come into power. So Evo Morales, who is the head of the movement for socialism in in Bolivia was ousted again in October through this violent coup. And so now there has been another resurgence of protests. And so far, as of right now, there are 70 roadblocks, which have really created some incredible tension, including that La Paz, which is Bolivia's largest metropolis, is marooned. I use the term marooned, but I think that is I don't. I think that that's an extreme term that's being used. Nonetheless, there's already been fears that the blockade will cause food shortages, gasoline shortages, and that many
medical supplies.
medical supplies, like
Sure.
a number of things. And of course, this is a protest in response to the lack of all of those things already. So I think it's that we can't. I don't want to the folks who are participating in this social justice work, these land defenders, these protesters, they are not the ones who should be criminalized, but of course they are the ones who will be
Well,
criminalized.
and it's important to understand these guys aren't cutting their nose to spite their face. They are literally sacrificing some of their abilities to live to move this forward to affect change. I mean, I think sometimes people can downplay the significance of what these roadblocks intend to do and the effects that they can have. Yes, they cause logistic nightmares. That we understand that, and they understand that. But sometimes you've got to take whatever place that you can demonstrate power and demonstrate it, even sometimes at your own expense.
Yes, and I don't want to act as if these are new. Again, this is a legacy of resistance against colonialism, and folks who, again, mostly indigenous Bolivian folks who are really organizing these roadblocks are doing it to bring to light that there already is a lack of food, lack of healthcare, and of course the continuous delay of elections, which is another huge part of this conversation. So protesters, though, may be causing some logistical issues in terms of access to cities. They are doing this in order to bring real change into their communities uh, and demanding for what honestly is righteously theirs. Access. Everyone should have access to food. Everyone should have access to water. Everyone should have access to health care. These are not new. And everyone, if they want to participate in some sort of election, are allowed to. And of course, we're the hope is that Evo Morales will be able to come back into power. He was exiled into Mexico and then is now apparently in Argentina.
Right.
And of course, the want is that he would come back into power in Bolivia to continue doing a great amount of work that he was doing, which of course is, he was anti-imperialist, pro-socialist, really working with he refused to live in the usual presidential household because he said that it was a monument to colonialism, which, like how boss is that? Like truly a visionary when it comes to politics. I hate politicians all around, but I really like Evo Morales.
Well, and I think it's important that people realize that the United States has been the most destabilizing factor in many of these countries. The United States has backed authoritarian leaders in every one of these countries, and it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, let's be honest here. I mean, when you talk about coups that have been done in a variety of countries, in Central and South America. I mean, the Obama administration was every bit as oppressive to the Venezuelan, the duly elected Venezuelan president, Chavez and Maduro. I mean, these guys have been. It crosses party lines when you look at the destabilizing effects that the United States has had on so many countries in Central and South America.
And we've seen, that there's been, according to the Washington Post article that was put out. So also, I apologize if y'all could hear the police
Yeah, it's New
siren.
York City. We get it.
Yeah. There. according to the Washington Post article that was put out about this earlier this week, in terms of the protests in Bolivia, that there have also been not just these blockades, but a number of miners, labor unionists, coca leaf farmers, indigenous activists taking to the streets as well, demanding that the National Electoral Council no longer delay the presidential election, which this is the second time, mind you, that it's been delayed. And of course, the justification is the spread of the coronavirus. Like, oh, we don't want people to go and participate in this because of the coronavirus. However, this decision has triggered a wave of rage among these leftist groups, because it's really interpreted as a way for this right wing President Añez, to continue being in presidency. And as you stated, Añez is she's a highly contentious interim president, very, very much a colonizer, trying to dictate what happens on indigenous land.
And I didn't mean to deride her the fact that she's got blonde hair, or how she looks. But the fact of the matter is she meets the criterion that that many of the colonizers have established. I mean, and so again, I'm not trying to criticize a woman's looks or anybody's looks, but look, when you look at how the racial lines have been are drawn there, I mean it becomes almost obvious.
Well, I think if you see the difference between Añez and Evo Morales, it is distinct. You have an indigenous person and a colonizer.
Right.
Like aesthetically, you cannot hide that at all. And it's purposeful, of course. And the other
thing is, it's amazing how quick the United States will accept an imposed leader through a military coup, whether it was Juan Guaido or Añez. I mean, it's amazing how quick the United States doesn't even, they don't even pretend to evaluate the circumstances or to have any kind of tentative diplomatic relations with these new upstarts. They just automatically dismiss the folks they didn't like and elevate in any way they can these authoritarian leaders.
And Añez, she comes from obviously the right. She's a conservative. She's brokered a lot of agreements with the Catholic Church, and
oil industries.
Oil industry. She loves extractive industries. And she initially pledged that she would not run for a full-term presidency, and that her priority was to establish these new elections. But of course, since she said that, she has actually declared her candidacy now to run for presidency. And this is coupled with, as we said, a lot of really horrible actions that the conservative parties have been enacting against indigenous people. And part of that includes that Bolivia is reported about 91,000 cases of COVID with 3,700 deaths. And Añez has been infected with COVID, and so have several other senior officials. And therefore, we can see even within the governing party, there is a lack of understanding of the intensity that coronavirus, that COVID has within our communities, and the hospitals that have overwhelming shortages of oxygen. Funeral homes are incredibly overwhelmed, and there's been and I just read about this last night. There's even been accusations of corruptions in terms of how hospitals are procuring ventilators
and who
how
gets to use them, that kind of thing.
Yes,
Sure, yeah.
Exactly. So
and there's also and it still seems crazy that in the United States this exists, but the idea that the dismissiveness of a pandemic also runs along these political lines. So when you look at these authoritarian and these conservative right-wing leaders, whether it's Bolsonaro or Añez or any of these folks, they seem to be the most dismissive, even as they themselves are facing infections and that kind of stuff. They create this air of of minimalizing the effects of this thing, which makes it that much more dangerous. It's why the United States numbers are the way. You have to draw a connection between the way that Trump has handled the COVID-19 and some of these other authoritarian leaders that he looks up to.
Yeah, it's it's actually it's really horrible. Of course, it's horrible to see these growing fascist governments really take hold of countries, including our own. If you don't think Trump's a fascist, um, something's wrong with you.
Look it up. Look it up.
It's the nicest way I can say that. Um, and the continued pushing off of elections is something that we are seeing in a number of countries, including our own.
Yeah, the United
And
States. I mean, there's no question that Trump is trying to delegitimize the election that he looks like he's poised to lose. I mean, whether he does or not. I mean, this is and this is a playbook that other authoritarian leaders have played by.
and as of right now, Agnes has rescheduled the election to October 18th. Um, unless these uprisings are successful, that is the decided date. I hope that that date is brought up sooner. Of course, if it is not, I would not be shocked if it's suddenly pushed back again. In terms of if COVID gets increasingly worse, which is we're seeing similar things right now here in the occupied United States in terms of criminalizing or weaponizing the USPS so that folks can't vote through that, or this talk of delaying the election, again for COVID. And I am wary rather of that kind of dialogue in
Well,
terms
I
of.
also get concerned when I see some of these people throw dates out like that out there. It reminds me that well, I've come to the conclusion that there was never a treaty or an agreement entered into by the United States with Indigenous people that they ever. Not that they kept those agreements, that they ever intended to keep those agreements. So when I see, a date thrown out there for October 18th, is that really a date that they intend to hold an election, or is that just something they throw out there to try to appease and try to minimize some of the protests that are happening? Because there is a bit of a calm. I mean, they again at one point there was almost 150 roadblocks, and it's about cut in half. So the effect of putting a date out there has benefited those who are trying to quell the protest. And I just wonder, is this even legitimate, or is it just a ploy?
I also I do want to say that I think that there still are more roadblocks, but I think that there are 70 specifically going into La Paz.
Okay.
I think there are more roadblocks in the country. But I'm going to actually do a little more research on that just out of curiosity now. But I do like that on this past Monday, Morales, who I said previously is now living in exile in Argentina, asked his supporters to consider a proposal from Bolivia's electoral tribunal that would describe October 18th election date as unpostponable and immovable. So he's specifically asking that Bolivians, that if this is the date that if that is decided on, that there is documentation that says that that date cannot be changed. Because he is even aware, and I think as many others are, that this doesn't seem right. And
Yeah.
it seems as though we're going to get close to October 18th, and suddenly it's going to change again, and then it's going to change again, and then Agnes or other conservatives will come into power, and there go the elections completely, which arguably is similar to things happening here.
Well, and I think it's important that people realize that just straight up incumbency is a huge benefit when you are facing an election, and it's even worse when the more authoritarian that incumbency is, because you have control of the military, you have control of the post office, you have control of the justice departments, you have control of all of these things, and then in the United States, look, over half of the governors in the United States are Republicans, and so and so much of this is dealt with at the state level. Elections are done at the state level, even for national office. But when you look at somebody who is in power, who knows that their power is or their support is waning, they will pull out all the stops. And and obviously you see it in other fascist governments, but you are seeing it in the United States. And and this is something that people really need to be aware of. And it'll be interesting. Look, the last election that took place in the United States, Trump won, even though he had almost 3 million fewer votes than his opponent. So that is not democracy, by any real definition of the word. And I'm not even saying democracies are the greatest systems in the world either. But I know that sounds like a terrible thing to say. But I think that anytime you're going to have, even if it's almost half of the population dissatisfied with the outcome of a decision-making process, that's problematic. And in the United States, for instance, and in some other countries where they don't have runoff elections, you can actually have people empowered. You can have laws passed. You can have all kinds of things happen that are done not by even a majority, but just by the largest plurality.
Absolutely. I mean, there is so much in there to unpack in terms of our own government system. Um, and I am curious, and I hope that as things continue to unfold, that folks continue to organize and radicalize. And I think that we can definitely take some really great pointers from the indigenous people, both in Chile and Bolivia, who are, taken to the streets for what's right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of courage that goes into affecting the kind of change, and I'm I could not be more impressed with what I'm seeing out of many of these indigenous populations standing up against huge forces against them. And I think Native people in the U.S. and Canada could cut a page from what other indigenous people have been willing to take on. And I think we need to do more. I'm not at all in any way, shape, or form discrediting some of the movements that are taking place. But
Of course, of
I think
course,
people have still become too passive. Look, Regan, great topic. I'm glad you suggested it. We'll follow up on this as news breaks. I
of
know
course.
we're coming to the end of the program. So again, thanks for some great content, and we look forward to doing this again next week.
All right, y'all. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you then, John.
All right. Hey, you guys, support WBAI, support Let's Talk. Pledge line 516-620-3602. This is John Kane with Regan DeLoggins, and we'll see you next week. Yahweh.